I'm here with Edie Edens. She's a senior compliance consultant with First Class Solutions. I've seen many of her LinkedIn posts, and I had the pleasure of being introduced to her recently. I thought she'd be a great resource because not only is she a compliance consultant, but she's also a practicing attorney and has a lot of experience negotiating contracts on behalf of clinical research sites. So, Edie, thank you for joining. Want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and your firm?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Absolute pleasure. So First Class Solutions is a firm that's been in the healthcare, health information technology, and management, billing, and coding space for quite some time. And in 2017, we moved into the life sciences space. So I'm getting to bring my experience in clinical research compliance, everything from the good old IRB and the FDA contracts, as we're going to talk about today, site-side compliance, of course, all the Q&A that goes with that, and then some of them is conduct pieces. So I got to bring that experience, and now I get to consult with anything from, or anyone, I should say, from individuals and sites to major research centers to help them with their programs, with their audits, with their needs, and in times like this, how to pivot, right? Because this is a
Yep.
this is a really unprecedented time for research,
Yeah.
and it's tough. It's tough
Yeah.
out there right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good segue or lead into what we want to talk to you about today, which is that in these current times, and we've seen this with a lot of the reporting that we've been doing on COVID, clinical research sites are doing additional workflows and taking on things that were not anticipated. So here are some examples of what we've seen and heard from some of our sites. Screen failing of patients, right? You're about to randomize them, you had to screen fail them. The sponsor told you to, or the patient declined. We're seeing situations where sites are delivering the IP to people's homes or going to the parking lot, which is a lot more work. Just simple things like pre-screening patients for symptoms, enhanced sanitation efforts, just gloves and masks for the staff, remote monitoring, which can be quite burdensome for sites, adoption of electronic systems, et cetera. Are you seeing this at some of your sites that you're working with?
Oh
That
my
you're
gosh. Yes, absolutely. All of these things. And of course, for me, from being the compliance side, then you got to find ways to document all these changes, not just by each trial and each patient, but globally. Like how are you responding? Is your site shut down? What's your emergency preparedness? If you're going to use remote modalities to keep the trial going, what does that look like? How are you ensuring compliance with kind of
yeah,
the changing FDA standards day by day? So yes, I mean, absolutely, in an exponential fashion. And
yeah.
this is really hard on the sites because they want to do right, but it's a lot of extra resources in a really resource scarce time.
Absolutely. And it's not just the extra work of doing this, but as you mentioned now, just thinking it through and
Yep.
developing policies and documenting it. So this is getting to the question, which is, can sites go to sponsors and ask for different compensation arrangements due to these unanticipated expenses? Is there
And
is there a pretty strong case?
I would say absolutely, right? I mean, if you are a site that is seeing these dramatic changes, your sponsor has to be aware of it. I don't
Yeah.
think there's anyone who doesn't understand the unprecedented times we're in right now. And I think it's a perfectly reasonable ask, right? You're not trying to renegotiate without some serious cause. And what you're asking for is going to be directly documented and linked back to exactly some of these examples. You're going to be able to show the extra work. You're going to be able to show the extra supplies, costs, et cetera, that are being spent to accommodate during this time. And that's just something that, I mean, the sponsor couldn't have foreseen, nor could the
Sure.
site. And that really is what contract amendments or some of the legal principles we're going to talk about are about and meant for. When something totally unforeseen and unanticipated happens, what do we do? How do we come back to the table and renegotiate so that it's fair to everyone and so that the sites are not expected to just entirely absorb these costs?
Right, exactly. So you had some tips or some pointers for sites. So let's go through some of the basics here. This is what you recommend the sites do in
Right.
terms of.
And this is going to seem a little simplistic from a lawyer, but I actually really very much encourage, of course, first get all your ducks in a row. So let's pull out that contract, okay? And let's get the individuals in the room who are comfortable reading and negotiating a contract, whether it's the folks that did it initially or someone on your team. You know best what that looks like. But let's actually look at what it says and when it allows for amendments and if it has some specific legal principles in it that would allow you to come back to the table, because you want to know what the contract says. You want to know your data, right? And then the next step after you've looked for, and we'll go into a little more detail about the different types of legal principles that might be in the contract, but just big picture, once you have that contract totally dissected, you understand your negotiation points, you understand, of course, your costs, right? What your needs are, what has changed. Then I want you to look at who your contacts at the sponsor are. Because admittedly, the day-to-day business contacts between your site and your sponsor may be more functional and at a different level than this issue, right? And that's not meant to be adversarial or saying, escalate it to the manager. That's far more of a look, we're at an odd time and I don't expect this contact that I have for the day-to-day activities of the trial to be responsible at this high of a level, right? So who do I go to? How do I begin to broach that topic and have that conversation? I think that's critical. And then once you know that, like I said, you have the data in your contract, you have the correct contact, be very clear about what your ask is here, right? Again, this is not a time to ask for everything you didn't get at the initial contract negotiation. That's not what this is about. Really stay focused on exactly what your costs, changes, and even what you anticipate, say, in the next 4 to 6 or even 8 weeks at your site, which I think we're going to talk about here in a minute as locales do contemplate reopening and what that looks like. And make sure you can give them a concise, almost executive summary, if you will, of here are all the pivot points. Here are all the places that are costing us money specific to your trial or trial sponsor where we need that assistance, and make sure you have some money attached to that, a budget revision. Because I think if you come correct like that, right, you have all your ducks in a row, you're not asking for any more than you legitimately need, you have all the facts on the table, you'll likely move pretty fast through this process. I would be saddened to hear that sponsors just give you the strong arm if you really come with that information. I'd be really shocked, honestly. I think they're renegotiating. I think they understand this is coming.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, it's helpful to have the SOPs in hand, I assume, because you can whip it out and say, here it is.
Absolutely, right. This is how we operate. And any changes that you've made, so like as you have pivoted and you've documented, hey, this is our contingency plan for this time, maybe you've been lucky enough to also get some SOPs changed and going, definitely have those documented. Like I said, I would start very gentle. I'm very big on, at least ask. You may find someone going, oh my gosh, we wondered when you were going to call. Yeah, we definitely need to help you. So you don't want to be coming with a big stick, right? You might not even need to pull out your SOP changes and prove them, but let's have them ready. Let's have our ducks in a row. So when you get to the right person, you can immediately have a meaningful and productive, quick conversation, because time, of course, is the essence for everyone right now. So that would be, and I think that they'll respond better to that when they see you have it all in order. You're not just raising your hand and screaming the sky is falling. When you've really thought it through and you have the documentation for the ask, they'll take you very seriously at that point. They'll know you mean business, and they know you have genuine needs, right? You're not just doing this to do this.
Right. Sure. So let's talk a little bit about the legal principles. As there's a couple of points in the contract I think you could potentially point to, right?
Right. And I would say, if just the initial broaching of the topic doesn't immediately garner a, yes, we expected this call, we know you're having to pivot type conversation, then the next place I would go is, look, we all know that the contract is essentially codifying that we're all going to comply with the agreements therein. And a lot of that has to do with the regulatory structure of research. And so we've provided here some links and a screenshot because, as I quote here and say, when the regulations shift, so do your operations and thus all your documentation, which includes your contracts. And here we are seeing individual states pivoting daily. We are seeing in some of these links, you're going to see daily, if not repetitive daily guidance from the FDA. Some of it is relaxation of regulations to be able to operate well during this time. Some of it is guidance on how to communicate with your regulatory structures. If you're checking in with your IRBs, whether institutional or commercial, I know definitely if they're institutional, and most of the commercial have all pivoted and sent out information to all of their users, their end users, their trials, to say, we expect you to be sending in amendments. We expect you to be putting things on hold or using remote modalities to get them moving. So I think you can, while it's not a very specific, citing of 21 CFR, et cetera, you can broach this topic with the sponsor and provide some of this data to essentially say, come on now, I know you're not living under a rock. You have to have seen all these changes too. Here's all the different places in the regulatory infrastructure that are demanding that we change and pivot. And this is also unprecedented, right? The FDA has never moved this quickly and had this much guidance and this much relaxation and or reworking of operations to actually support the regulatory infrastructure. And the IRBs are very much saying the same thing. We're expecting the amendments, we're expecting the changes, just get them to us with a really nice summary of what needs to change, why, how long you anticipate it. We'll evaluate it and try to get it back to you as fast as possible. So if all of your otherwise viewed as burdensome regulatory infrastructures are urging you to change and pivot,
Right.
my goodness, sponsor, really, you're not going to be a part of that change.
Yeah.
And I think where you come back to the contract is in those specific regulatory sections of your contract where it says things like you will submit changes to the IRB in advance of doing them. You will follow the regulatory infrastructure in the 21 CFRs, in the common rule.
Right.
Well, in order to do that, you have to change.
Sure.
Right? And so that is how you tie that back to the contract and begin to escalate the conversation. Like I said, if the sponsor doesn't at least initially recognize and open conversation.
Sure. I mean, you're taking the posture, you're abiding by the regulatory environment around you. And that has clearly changed because when the states mandate, stay at home, there are certain implications to site. And so you have different workflows you didn't anticipate at the outset of the contract, but you have to implement just to stay compliant. And you can see that reinforced with the FDA guidance. Encouraging that. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's a rare day when the FDA and the IRB openly say, we expect you to be, peppering us and papering us with immediate changes to your protocols. And we don't think that's a bad thing.
Right.
We don't think you're doing right. Like, that's just unprecedented. I've been in this business for over a decade and I've never seen anything like that ever. So I think that just, again, creates, and you tie it back to those sections in your contract and say, hey, the FDA is changing. And the IRB I work with is changing. And you may even as a site have specific communication from the IRB that you work with that says some of these pieces. I know many of my clients have received that type of communication. I would add that to the list of documents you're going to have right there waiting to communicate with the sponsor. To say, really? My IRB actually even urged me to make changes. Gosh, that's pretty rare. So this gives you fodder, right? And then and again, you tie it back to those sections in the contract.
Yeah. That's a good principle. Okay, good. And then let's talk about another one here.
So this is my okay. You're gosh darn. You've really tried to negotiate here, and unfortunately, the sponsor is just hardlining you at this moment in time. I can't guarantee that your contract is going to have a force majeure clause in it, but many clinical trial agreements and research contracts actually do. You don't have to be a lawyer to understand this. Essentially, you're welcome to read the legalese if it's in your contract. What you need to look for is a title, right, in your sections and numberings in your contract that says force majeure. If it says it, what it means is essentially something that is so large, so unprecedented, so unanticipated, often referred to as an unforeseeable act of God, that completely changes all the variables to the point that a contract will either be completely invalidated, nullified, or need to be renegotiated with those new variables in mind. For those of you that find this section in your contract, if your sponsor, like I said, just absolutely hardballs you, this is it, right? And this is your, as you'll see on the PowerPoints here, this is your last line of defense. I don't want you to start guns blazing with this. It's not the way to go. But if it comes down to it, the last 3 bullet points are what you're going to say to the sponsor. This is the key language that comes out of force majeure in this situation. You're having a significant labor interruption or disruption, right? Because you're having to completely pivot who can come to your site, how remote work is established, how patient visits can take place. And probably you may even have workers who are sick, right? Or caregivers for individuals who are sick during this time and can't work at all, right? Can't even be exposed. So you're having this labor interruption and disruption. It is because of this unforeseeable, if you want to say act of God, you can. I would personally probably say this public health crisis and emergency, which again is unprecedented. And due to that, you have a legal right to renegotiate the contract. Period. End of story. Now, what I will say is, again, in that vein of trying to not take this to an adversarial place unless it's necessary, because heavens knows none of us need more stress than we already have right now. I would remind the sponsor that in a quote unquote renegotiation, an option for them and for you as a site that is smart and will work for everyone and protects everyone is a contract amendment, because those can be set in a time frame. So you could essentially agree on what needs to change in that amendment, right? A new budget, accordingly would be an attachment to that amendment with the associated unanticipated expenses that you're asking be covered. And then you set a time frame for that amendment. You say, this is active from, the effective date that we executed until the conclusion of this public health crisis. And you can offer some language that you both agree on that will act as conclusion. Maybe it's when your locale is entirely reopened. Maybe it's when the United States as a whole is reopened. Only you and the sponsor can negotiate that. But there can be a time cap on that amendment, so it protects everyone. We're not saying in 12 months when everything's hopefully back to normal that we need these expenses anymore and we can drop the amendment, right, and go back to what we originally negotiated. A lot of times that's a better angle because, again, sponsors are used to amendments over time. Contract amendments aren't odd, especially in the clinical trial agreement world. They happen quite frequently. And if you have any type of master agreements with these sponsors, this is just business as usual to issue amendments. It's just a different type of amendment. So that might be an angle you suggest to kind of say, I'm trying to be nice. I'm still trying to negotiate here, but I do have force majeure on my side.
Sure.
Period.
And the other way to do it also maybe to have a budget amendment where it's expressed as a per unit of instance or so. For each time I have to do a phone pre-screener, I'll charge you this, and we're going to do it as long as it's prudent. So you give yourself a little bit of wiggle room, but to some degree, you should be entrusted to have the common sense to do something, and you're not doing it just for the sake of doing it.
This isn't easy on anyone. No one wants to be doing it this way. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I think that's another angle, and make it work for you. I mean, you'll know as you're having these conversations if you're not getting anywhere. And so again, that slide earlier where I talk about getting your data, clarifying your ask, having your budget, having your proposal, like you said, is it going to be a per unit? Is it going to be a per time frame? If you get to this place, stop for a moment, regroup and get that data together. So when you come with this type of a principal ask, you can have all that ready yet again.
Yeah. And I think that having it on a per unit basis can be helpful, especially you think about some states are actually starting to talk about opening up, but we're talking potentially a scenario we could close down again in a few months. And some of these practices may have to continue even as you start seeing patients again. You may see patients in a different manner than before and have a different way of doing things.
For quite some time.
For a while.
Right. Yeah. And I think you can always do, like if you did the per unit, like you were saying, if the sponsor was really worried, they might put a cap. And so, have a reasonable cap, knowing your trials, knowing what your patient population is pivoting into, if they're staying on trial, if they're wanting to stop, what they're doing. So if they want to put some type of limit, and what I would try to negotiate is more like a limit check. Like after this many, we will have a conversation about whether or not this should continue. So it's not a hard stop for the site. It's not like, oh my gosh, you only get 25 and then you're done. We're not going to get reimbursed. But it does give the sponsor the right to have that conversation and to, again, revisit, because communication is really important right now. That could be a good thing. You may need to pivot at the end of that cap more than, again, we could have anticipated based on if your locale is opening. I do anticipate some of the locales that are trying to open early, we may have some setbacks, like you said, and have to reclose and reopen in some spaces. And so that may be actually a way to go.
Yeah, you could also do a time period of say 4 months, but then it can renew for another 2 months or something if both parties agree.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there's a lot of ways to go about this and specify it for your site to make it work for your people, and to present it in a way that I think is honestly very reasonable to the sponsors. 100% reasonable to the sponsors.
Sure. Yeah, especially now in these times, the sites are just getting killed financially.
Well, yeah, and you're not asking for a carte blanche checkbook here.
Right.
You're asking for some very specific needs in a very, very unprecedented time.
Yeah.
It's just not unreasonable. Like I said, we already, in normal, quote unquote, pre-COVID normal times, we do contract amendments and changes all the time in large organizations. I mean, it's a constant process. And so having an amendment or a change really isn't something sponsors are in any way against or afraid of or, unfamiliar with. It's a different type, right? You're changing the budget, you're asking for more money, and that's an odd feeling. That's not something we normally do in those amendments, but it's very, very warranted here. And you have the data, use the data, and use, like I said, these FDA statements from your IRBs, if you're in an institutional one, or if you have a commercial one, like I know WCG has been exceedingly forthcoming with their clientele, as well as I believe Advera in the commercial IRB world, saying, hey, we recognize this is coming. We recognize there are changes. And they're even offering like education to their sites and free
Yeah.
webinars on what to
Yeah.
do and how to handle this. So I think you can use that, as kind of circumstantial information to say we're just in a really unique time right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Terrific. Good. Fantastic. So one last thought you had was maybe what we can learn from this, or how we might change contracts going forward, not necessarily the current ones, but in future contracts.
Yeah, I'm a big lessons learned person. I feel like if we're going to go through all this, we better get some silver linings out of it, right? I definitely hope that we do move toward more remote modalities, virtual trials, et cetera. Maybe that'll be something that comes out of this. But I do think from that contract piece, some of the sites I have seen fare better during this, at least thus far, have very smartly, and not because they could have anyway predicted COVID, but for other reasons, they actually have like an unanticipated cost, small line item on their budgets, right? And they've negotiated with the sponsor examples of what those unanticipated expenses could be, as well as limits, right? That the sponsor will allow them to kind of dip into or have that fund versus limits at which it would require a renegotiation. And so a lot of my sites have used this line item, excuse me, to fund and assist in some of these pivotal changes right now. And from what I've said, without obviously revealing confidentiality, their sponsors have not even batted an eye. In fact, they've been kind of happy that that pool existed because they haven't had to go through a contract renegotiation, and they've been willing to pay. Now, when the site exhausts that small budget line item, that's a whole nother conversation, right? And it could very well happen because I think we're going to be in this for a little while. But for lessons learned, think about how that would work in your contract negotiations at your site to begin adding that in. Because it could, I mean, again, huge unprecedented situations like COVID, you may have to renegotiate no matter what. But in other slightly smaller situations, or maybe these locales that open early, but then kind of have to close and reopen, these would be budget line items you could be pulling from immediately that you have access to. You'll have the documentation to justify the expenses to the sponsor, and you wouldn't necessarily have to go through quite as much renegotiation. And so we've given some example language here of what that would look like. And again, it's very sponsor specific. Some will be okay with this, some may just shut you down, but it's definitely worth trying to have. It's almost, in my mind, like a petty cash, right? On your clinical trial, that doesn't exceed a certain limit and has very good confines on what it's used for, but also doesn't require a complete contract renegotiation and trying to get a hold of the sponsor and have this whole conversation before you can touch it.
Sure.
And so I think that's a big one. Like I said, the sites I know that already do that, they have been able to get at least thus far through the process without having to do too much contract renegotiation yet, because they had enough extra funds in their
Sure.
in that pool.
Sure.
So I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. And like you said, if you had a series of SOPs, you could sort of package them as our disaster recovery or business continuity plan. And then since you know what they are and you've tested it before, you've gone through it, you have this almost off the shelf, and you can even put that in as a contingent expense.
Oh, absolutely. That's a silver lining of all of this, right? Is like, now you have the data. Now you've done it, you've lived it, so you can totally use that to negotiate this. And if you're operating still and keeping your trials open during this time, from a compliance perspective, you've already had to write something about the disaster preparedness that you're doing. You've already had to write something to document in your SOPs how you pivot in a situation like this. So use it, right? Use that long term to renegotiate and to do contracts in a way that think broadly about these unanticipated times, and protect you more. And I would think sponsors, I mean, they're smart. They have to anticipate that this is going to change how negotiations work in the future. They know that this is a changing time. They know that this is a whole new precedent. So they may not love it, but they know it's coming, right? You're not going to be the first site that's knocking on their door about this information.
Sure. Okay, well, terrific. Well, thank you so much, Edye. So if anyone wants to reach out to you, what's the best way?
Yeah, absolutely. Our website is www.firstclasssolutions, that's plural.com. You can reach me on LinkedIn, Edye, Edye, Edens, Edens. And you can also reach me on my email. It's just my first name, edye.edens@firstclasssolutions.com. Happy to answer questions and follow up. Happy to help sites navigate this time, and know it's really stressful out there.
Terrific. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Raymond.